Last week's hearing on climate change and public health was another missed opportunity to discuss our nation's ailing fiscal health. That same day, House Republicans passed legislation to rein in excessive government spending, lift the debt ceiling, and impose meaningful fiscal controls. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats haven't lifted a single finger. Now, instead of working together to write a responsible budget, we're here discussing an alleged scheme involving fossil fuel overlords. Rather than attacking important American businesses that employ tens of thousands of Americans, we should work together to reduce an unsustainable national debt. Reaching a consensus will require us to respectfully listen to opinions of experts whose views may differ from our own. No one learns anything sitting in an echo chamber. This is one reason why I've invited witnesses with a variety of views during this series of climate change hearings. Sometimes I've discussed with a witness that I invited on this or that subject, but sometimes I've disagreed with witnesses I've invited on this or that, but I value their opinions. Today is no different with Ms. Fischer-Roth, and I don't see eye to eye on all energy matters, particularly when it comes to renewable fuels and wind. However, we do agree oil and gas are critical to lowering energy costs, protecting our national security, and reducing CO2 emissions. We also agree that President Biden's war on fossil fuels has been disastrous for economy and terrible for consumers. I believe in all of the above energy strategies: oil, gas, biofuel, wind. We need them, all for national security and for economic success. President Biden, on the other hand, believes in all of the history of his preferred and none of the rest strategy. It's kind of simple. In this town, people say they're all of the above. Well, half of them are for none of the above, but everything below. And the other half are for everything above the above, but nothing below the ground. This sort of one size fits all to solving this problem just doesn't make sense. I've been saying for 30 years, long time before climate change was much of a debate, that we had 4 goals that we had to have for energy policy. 1, fossil fuels. Number 2, all the alternative energy you can think of. And number 3, conservation, both government imposed and personally imposed. And 4, nuclear. It seems to me that that's still a policy we're going to have for the next 25 years, except for the unrealistic views that we can get everything by wind tomorrow. Poor policy decisions have consequences, and as a result, we've seen energy prices rise substantially across the board. This is why the 2 leading topics of concern that I've heard from Iowans during the Biden administration have been inflation and the price of gasoline. The president can deflect blame all he wants, but the rise in the price of gasoline has been a direct consequence of his administration's energy policies. Candidate Biden vowed to end fossil fuels during his campaign. On his first day in office, he decided to shut down the Keystone Pipeline, stifling our ongoing energy independence and killing thousands of jobs. Also on January 2021, he issued an executive order pausing new oil and gas leases on public lands and federal waters. And now he complains because Saudi is cutting down on the pumping of oil by $1 million a day and the price going up. And we've reduced the National Strategic Reserve to the lowest level in 40 years. It just doesn't make sense that we would stop jobs in this country to increase more jobs in Saudi Arabia and import the oil here, and probably dirtier oil than we'd produce in this country. A barrage of his destructive environmental regulations followed, which continue to prevent the construction of much-needed fossil fuel infrastructure. Last month, President Biden issued his first veto to uphold his 401k investment rule. The rule will even hurt everyday Americans' investment, just to further liberal environmental, social, corporate governance, or ESG as you know it. Whereas the federal law requires, under ERISA, that the fiduciary has a responsibility to make sure that you get the most return on your money. That's what the law says. And this administration, through ESG, is violating that law. And just a few weeks later, President Biden's EPA announced his plan to mandate 2/3 of all new vehicles by electric by 2032. These are the same EVs most Americans can't afford, the same EVs that they say in California last year don't plug in during the heavy use of utilities because you may not get the electricity to charge your EV. But Democrats want to continue subsidizing these as part of their misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, which by now the CBO has proven to us not going to reduce inflation, but actually enhance inflation. And that's that green energy program that's within that bill that has a price tag that seems to be ballooning way above what CBO said it was going to be. And to prove that, we have the Joint Committee on Taxation telling us its tax subsidies will cost $300 billion more than originally advertised, and its cost could rise further once we see updated scores of EV subsidies. The average price of an electric vehicle, according to Kelley Blue Book, is $65,000, roughly the equivalent of Iowa's median household income. But even if half of the Americans could afford an EV, which they can't, an even bigger problem exists. We have neither the load capacity nor the materials to achieve President Biden's energy overhaul. Large swaths of the U.S. electric grid are at risk for shortfalls this summer. Grid reliability is a significant concern already, let alone the concerns over the grid handling load of the President Biden's electric vehicle fantasy. Moreover, we all know that the Communist Party of China has a monopoly on critical mineral mining and refining required to build EV batteries. They're forcing Uyghurs into slavery to bolster their supply chains. That's all being supported by this administration. Meanwhile, environmentalists won't allow us to permit mining projects here in the United States. And think of the inconsistency between the human rights policies of this administration, which I have no disagreement with, but letting the Uyghurs with forced labor to produce some of the stuff that we're going to use in our electric vehicle cars. Or look at what, I think it's cobalt or something else that we get from the Congo Republic, that child labor is being used to produce. And this administration and the Republicans in this Congress are against using child labor for anything as far as that's concerned. So not only is this administration pushing policies that drive up the price of gasoline, but their policies would make us even more dependent on a supply chain that runs directly through China. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Let me just take a moment and salute you for your long-term leadership.